this is a defining conflict because it is in Europe, or whatever happens in Europe becomes a defining everything of everything. But obviously, conflicts that happen elsewhere in the world, people there would think there is a defining conflict. Yes, it is Donald Trump who does this so-called shuttle diplomacy, and sort of today he speaks well of Putin and not well of Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Tomorrow he will speak badly of Putin. The war is going on, but the Russian society continues to live in many ways as if it's not happening. These are the things that he's not going to back off of just because NATO, he says, is a threat to Russia for years to come.
Exactly.
Every country needs an enemy, because otherwise how are you going to define yourself against somebody else?
That's well said.
Right. The bigger your enemy is, the more powerful you look. Putin did an amazing thing. I mean, with fighting in Ukraine over not joining NATO, he actually made NATO much closer to the borders from every other side. It's one of the things that the Putin state excels at, is to create very angry and very militaristic propaganda. So Putin needs his Donbass. That's not negotiable, because he already decided that that's going to be, that's how he declares victory. Russia is a global villain. It has been very justly and unjustly a global villain. It's a convenient enemy in addition to everything else. I'm not seeing a resolution, although I do think that this year potentially created a bit of a softening and a bit of a resolution for maybe next year. Putin loves Catherine the Great. About Catherine, he said that she took more lands, but she shed less blood. Sometimes early on in his existence as president, he would go and buy an ice cream, but it would be an ice cream that a KGB checked person would be selling. like from a James Bond movie. European leaders were saying, well, we are going to force Putin. And it's like, you're not going to force Putin anywhere. I mean, he's not a forcible actor. Like, the more you force him, the worse it's going to get.
Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching Hindustan Times, and my name is Aisha Varma. Today we're diving into one of the most defining conflicts of our time, the war in Ukraine, and examining how it continues to shape Russia's identity, politics, and standing in the world. Joining us is a remarkable guest, Professor Nina Khrushcheva. She is a scholar of international affairs, an expert on Russian politics, and the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, the former Soviet leader who once faced his own defining standoff with the West during the Cold War. Thank you, Nina, for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
What is your take on the Russia-Ukraine war?
How long is your program? I mean, that's a very big question.
Yes.
It's been 4 years, almost 4 years. It's brutal conflict. Both sides are sticking to their guns, which is sort of pun intended and not intended, because there's a lot of gunfight going on, obviously. And all the efforts to bring it to the end and produce some kind of peace so far have not been successful, because both sides really have issues and demands that they consider red lines, and we can talk about those particular things in later questions and answers. But of course, this conflict, and you say it's the defining conflict of our times, I'm sure other conflicts would disagree, because this is a defining conflict because it is in Europe, or whatever happens in Europe becomes a defining everything of everything. But obviously, conflicts that happen elsewhere in the world, people there would think there is a defining conflict. So let's just make sure that we're not looking at it from that one particular perspective. But certainly it occupies the headlines precisely because it is Russia. Russia is a global villain. It has been very justly and unjustly a global villain. It's a convenient enemy in addition to everything else. But it's something that, as you said, when you were introducing me, you spoke about Khrushchev, who faced his own issues with the West during the Cold War. So this is in some ways a continuation of the collapse of the Soviet empire, the collapse of the Soviet space in 1991, and Russia continues to be undefined relations with the West and with its neighboring Europe. So in this sense, it's a big conflict because it's a big chunk of the world that defines global affairs in many ways.
But I'm very happy you brought up that point about how it compares to other conflicts and the way that it's perceived. We're going to circle back to that in a bit. Another big question coming up next: what do you think it's going to take for the war to end?
Well, I'm actually going to sort of cite Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, because he's the one who now defining the conflict in many ways. Yes, it is Donald Trump who does this so-called shuttle diplomacy and sort of the today he speaks well of Putin and not well of Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Tomorrow he will speak badly of Putin, but reasonably well enough about Vladimir Zelensky. But generally, as Putin said in the last few days, especially, has been so seen in the military uniform, showing that he's in charge, and the Russian army advancing in Ukraine, however slowly, but still advancing. And basically, he's going to be deciding, in a sense, what kind of final outcome of a peace agreement it's going to be. So far, his big red lines, as they say, Ukraine is not joining NATO. I mean, one of the reasons, as he explains, the war began, they call it special military operation. In fact, Putin confirmed that it's not going to be a war, at least for now. He's not going to call it a war. All there have been predictions that he should, and then full mobilization and so on. He says that the special military operation is doing surgically. And it is true that the war is going on, but the Russian society continues to live in many ways as if it's not happening in many places. So for him, Ukraine is not joining NATO. That's important for him because he promised at the beginning of this war, beginning of special military operation, that the Russian army went in to support and protect the people of those eastern republics of not republics, eastern regions of Ukraine, which is Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk. So he says, as long as we are not at the border of Donetsk and Luhansk, I think that Luhansk, they almost took over the whole thing. But as long as we're not at the border with Donetsk, we are not going to stop. And these are the things that he's not going to back off just because NATO, he says, is a threat to Russia for years to come.
Exactly.
And with Donetsk, then he will have to answer to his own patriots who said, well, you promised all this, so this is his minimum. He can stop in other places, but that's his minimum. But imagine what it is for Ukraine. I mean, why would Ukraine give up the territory that the Russians haven't even invaded? So that's a problem for them. And they say the joining NATO is in our constitution. So how could we not do that in a constitution? Because it's in our constitution. So in this sense, there's at least two things. I mean, there are others, but at least two things that both sides, at least for now, cannot absolutely agree on. And also the size of Ukrainian army after the conflict ends, because Putin wants demilitarization, as he put it, so less of Ukrainian army. But of course, Ukraine cannot trust the Russian state not to go back into Ukraine, so they would want the army. So for now, I'm not seeing a resolution, although I do think that this year potentially created a bit of a softening and a bit of a resolution for maybe next year.
Okay. So coming back to something that you have just spoken about, how much of a threat is NATO to Russia in your point of view?
Well, I mean, I'm not the president of Russia. I don't
Hmm.
think NATO was a threat to Russia ever. The whole point of NATO was that they would be. I mean, NATO was the product of World War II, as we remember. So it was the defensive alliance. If the Soviet Union decides to exercise its rights to, I don't know, bring communism into further parts of the world, which was very much so in during Stalin times when NATO was created. Then during Khrushchev, it actually changed. I mean, they became so-called peaceful coexistence. So they were not really bringing communism militarily as much as Stalin would have wanted. Uh,
Mm.
but so it was an alliance that should have collapsed after 91. And it was collapsing after 91. But, why would any alliance want to collapse? I mean, their jobs, their positions, there's importance, their leverage, there's a lot of other things. So it didn't collapse. And the more the West would have problems with Vladimir Putin, or even earlier in the 2000s, when he first became president, the more NATO was feeling we are going to really stand up to Putin. What if, and so on and so forth. So the more they would do their rhetoric, the more he would say, well, I told you, you're a threat. You are a threat. And so I think in some ways it was kind of the two sides were doing tango, because for two sides propagandistically, it was an important form of presenting their own value, because, every country needs an enemy, because otherwise how you're going to define yourself against somebody else.
That's
Uh,
well said.
right. The bigger your enemy is, the more powerful you look. And I think actually that's why Russia was, now there was a war, and so Putin really fit into those shoes of a great and horrible enemy. But in the 1990s and the early 2000s, he really wasn't that big of a threat, I don't think. But you kind of, you have to do it, because otherwise, horrible Russia, it's going to come over and take you over, and whatnot. So you make a threat bigger. Putin would respond in making his own threat bigger of the West and NATO and what.
Mm.
Ultimately, it was a case of wishful thinking. I mean, everybody created an enemy that then turned into a horrible physical force, not just the propaganda force. Putin did an amazing thing. I mean, with fighting in Ukraine over not joining NATO, he
Yes.
actually made NATO much closer to the borders from every other side. So in some ways, the story was kind of once again a case of wishful thinking. And if you want to fight the enemy, that you actually make a hypothetical one. The reason you want a hypothetical, because then you look strong, and you can do a lot of things by pretending that you're actually defending against a threat, but then you create a threat close to you. So I don't believe it was a threat, but I can see how it can become a threat, because now Europe has become, when I talk about Russia and Ukraine and red lines, I mean, we also have to remember that, of course, Europe is a big actor in this conflict, but sort of side to this conflict as well. And so for them, being engaged on the Ukrainian side means essentially preparing for war, because they've been associating themselves with the warring side of this conflict. And so when Europe talks about war with Russia, Putin, of course, responds in kind and says, fine, you want a war with me? Bring it on. And so in this sense, I think it becomes incredibly dangerous, because so far they've been just bluffing and thinking that the other side will blink. But it seems to me that the rhetoric is so cavalier on both sides that ultimately this rhetoric can turn into something physical and real.
So then, okay, here, and this relates to everything that you've also just been speaking about. What is your opinion on Putin saying that Russia was robbed by the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine?
Of course, because you find the as they say, hot button issue. I mean, I don't know why Crimea would be hot button issue, but just assume that this is uh, Russian heritage. Supposedly, that's where it got. Catherine the Great. Putin loves Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great got Crimea out of Turkey, and so Crimea became one of her victories. Putin at one point said, "Well, and Catherine the Great was even better than Peter," and he loves Peter. He loves his greats. I mean, whatever the great is, this is his predecessor. But about Catherine, he said that she took more lands, but she shed less blood. So that's my role model. So Crimea became Russian under Catherine the Great. The kind of the one of the imperial origins, the early years of Russian Empire. And so, of course, I mean, Putin is a good propagandist. I mean, he's a great PR person for his own narratives. And so once you use the word robbed, and you use, once again, you have Crimea, and then you have Khrushchev, who people don't like because he was very much like them. I mean, he was not separated from the people like Putin. I mean, 10 cars
Yes.
going, and sometimes early on in his existence as president, he would go and buy an ice cream, but it would be an ice cream that a KGB checked person would be selling. like from a James Bond movie. But Khrushchev he was a public politician. He was a man of the people, which sounds strange in Soviet context, but because that's what they declared, but never really upheld in later years. But he was. So you put Khrushchev in, you have Ukraine, which people don't know that Khrushchev was not born there, because they just assume that because he was like that, he must not be our great Russian firm, serious and very unapproachable apparatchik. And so basically that's it. The propaganda picture is created, and the angry propaganda picture is created.
Hmm.
That's one of the things that the Putin state excels at, is to create very angry and very militaristic propaganda. So, and Khrushchev is a great kind of great subject of that.
All right. So, speaking of militaristic propaganda, there has been no breakthrough as far as the Russia Ukraine war is concerned, despite multiple rounds of talks being held. Why do you think a peace deal isn't working out? And what do you think Putin's larger aims are with this war?
Well, as I said, I mean, there are things that are red lines for both sides, and they cannot cross
Yes.
them. So Putin needs his Donbass. That's not negotiable, because he already decided that that's how he declares victory. He doesn't want Ukraine and NATO. NATO, I mean, in some ways, it is a Pyrrhus victory, because I mean, Russia is going to be pariah, not with countries that are not in the orbit of the West. Let's put it this way. But still, I mean, Russia is a country in Europe, largely, and that's a relationship that has ruined for a long time. If not for, I mean, nothing is forever, but for a long time. So in some ways, he that is destruction of Russia, in many ways. Destruction is that the future is a very grim one of an isolated country from certain
Yeah.
parts of the world, and certainly from the neighbors, which is important. But at the same time, for Putin, no NATO. Ukraine is no NATO. So that I don't think he can negotiate on. Then Ukrainian troops, because he said
Mm.
demilitarization of Ukraine. So Ukrainian troops has to be reduced, even by 5 people. But he needs to, because one of the things that I kept saying from the beginning of this war, when European leaders were saying, well, we are going to force Putin, and it's like, you're not going to force Putin anywhere. I mean, he's not a forcible actor. Like, the more you force him, the worse it's going to get. So if you actually want to force him somewhere, you need to talk to him. But, Kaya Kallas says, no talking to the Russians. Fine, no talking to the Russians. So for Putin, it only proves his point that the West hates us, and so we need to defend ourselves. So then the troops demilitarization. He promised it has to be achieved. So these are the three things. And of course, there's a lot of conversation about frozen assets because Europe so far has not been able to do it. It's against democratic laws of Europe. And for him, I don't think he believes that this money would ever go back to Russia, but it's a great propaganda argument for him saying, well, look, the West, they hate us so much. Of course, we have to defend ourselves. They hate us so much that even they're willing to break their own laws to undermine our existence. So as long as it happens, he's fine. I mean, he has a military economy now. It's much hurt by the sanctions, by the not embargo, but tariffs and sanctions and tariffs and so on. But Russia is a very big country, as the many Indians who travel there can attest from the past and maybe even in the present. It's a country of 11 time zones. One of the books that I did write, and it is in English, it's called In Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of Empire right across 11 time zones. It's a very big country. So it would take time to collapse. It's going to get worse and worse. But Ukraine has less time. Like Ukraine doesn't have that much time to collapse. And also the territories are taking over. So basically what he wants in this conflict, he's not going to lose. So this small things that he promised, or big things that he promised in his initial decision to invade, he has a list of them and they have to be checked. And even if it is a name only, as I said, 800. So the Ukrainian army supposedly now is 800 plus 1,000 people. So the Russians wanted it, or at least the Americans suggested it's going to go to 600, and Russians seem to have agreed. Like 200,000 is not going to make a big difference, but it needs a difference for Putin to say, check, demilitarized, check, denato memberized, and so on. And I think that's exactly what it's going to take. And the question is how much more Ukraine needs to lose to ultimately potentially agree to this.